Good evening, everyone. There we go.
Hi.
Good evening. Hope everyone's doing well tonight, and we'll get started here in just a minute and have everybody work on your flashlight tonight. All right.
Good. All right.
For now. Hey, Tiff.
Yeah.
How do you mute and unmute this thing if we need to?
I want to mute. It's on the bottom left.
High CPU usage is affecting meeting quality. Is that something we should worry about? So that would mute us, but not him, right?
Right. We're not muted.
Okay.
I'm going to go to mute.
Is there a password for this meeting?
I believe there is, and let me see if it says in the email.
Okay.
Okay, the password, does someone need that right now?
Yes.
Okay, it's 1 lowercase h, capital P, 3 lowercase t, capital T.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay, I've unmuted everybody so everybody can say good evening this evening and introduce yourself. And I'm Brandon Stevens. I'll be giving the workshop this evening. Hello. And who do we have up there? We have, looks like William. Hello. Okay. And I bet that's not William. I bet we've got somebody else there.
Should I stream camera?
It's up to you.
I don't know. I can't
Okay.
tell if I'm talking or not.
So we'll get started here, and feel free to ask any questions at any time. So we're going to go through the assembly steps for your Jake light that we're going to build here, the magnetic powered flashlight. And we're going to let you go through and build each of the parts here. And I've got a slideshow that shows you some of the parts here. So I'm going to share my screen with you and get that information up here for you. And let me.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that up on your screen there.
Yep.
Okay, great. So we're going to build this flashlight, and this is what the finished product will look like here. So this is our goal, is to have this flashlight so that you can power it up and use it using a magnet here. That's going to generate the electricity to power the electronics on here and light up the light at the end. And we'll talk about that. Okay. And some of the tools that you're going to need here today, and you probably have some of those already. And if you don't, you can go get those at any time during the presentation. But you'll need some kind of a little electronic cutters, some flush cutters there, maybe a pair of needle nose pliers to help you get some of the parts installed, and then a soldering iron stand to hold your soldering iron, and some type of soldering iron today. And then the solder that we're going to be using is a 60-40 rosin core solder. And you may have something similar to it, but you need some type of electronic solder or electrical solder. If you have something that says acid core solder, you don't want to use that on your electronics. That's made for plumbing, and will damage the electronics. So make sure yours says some kind of electronic solder or rosin core solder. And then you'll need some wire strippers and a pair of pliers, maybe, and a rubber band, and safety glasses so you can protect your eyes while you're soldering. Okay, so I talked about the soldering there, and we want to make sure to protect your eyes, and so make sure to do that. And also remember that your soldering iron is very hot. It's probably in the excess of 600 degrees, so you want to make sure that you don't touch any of the parts that aren't insulated or required to be protected there for your hands. So don't touch any of the metal parts when you're working with that. And then after you're done, you'll want to make sure to wash your hands, and we'll want to finish up your work there. The solder typically does contain lead, and lead is poisonous to our bodies if it's ingested, so you don't want to ingest any of the lead solder. So you're going to take that and wash your hands and make sure to remove any of that part there. And our workshop tonight will be about 30 minutes long here, and we'll take a 15-minute break. I only have the free version of Zoom, so it'll end at 30 minutes into our presentation here, but that's fine. We'll take a little 15-minute break, and then what I can do is figure out how to restart the meeting. I may need to send you an email with additional instructions to join back up, and if that happens, we'll let you join back up with the new meeting invite. I'm not for sure. I haven't done one that's over 30 minutes, but hopefully we'll be able to rejoin and continue on with that when that happens. And like I said, feel free to ask questions at any time. So the very first thing that we're going to start here is we're going to be using the 2 red wires in our kit that we're going to be doing, and we're going to remove the insulation. You may have a pair of wire strippers like this, or some type of wire stripper that has some gauged holes on it. The wire that we're going to be removing the red insulation from is going to be a 22 gauge wire. And so maybe on your pliers or your wire strippers here, you'll see that they're marked with gauge hole sizes here. And so you'll want to find the 22 gauge and remove some of the insulation here. And I'm going to talk about removing the insulation, and then you guys can work through that there. And the easiest way, or one of the ways to do the removal of the insulation, is to squeeze the wire strippers and close the jaws. And we want to, again, only remove the insulation part. We don't want to cut through the conductor, the wire, okay? And once you squeeze down, if you will release the pressure just slightly, then it will allow the jaws of the wire stripper to open up a little bit, and then you can use the tool to help slide the insulation off of the wire. And you don't have to use the tool to remove the insulation after you've cut it with the wire strippers, but it sure does help. But our goal is not to nick or damage any of the insulation or the conductor when we're removing the insulation. And here's an example here of a wire that's been stripped. We're going to remove about 1/4 of an inch here of insulation. And if you're not sure how much that is, if you can think about how thick a quarter is, if you stack 4 of them together, that's about 1/4 of an inch. If you have a ruler there, you can measure and kind of eyeball it. It's not critical that we get exactly 1/4 of an inch removed, but that gets us a little bit of a help. And then let me talk about one more thing as you're working with that here. One of the things is we said we don't want to damage the conductor. And if you look here on this slide here, the conductor, you can see where the insulation has been removed, but it was cut down into the conductor and it will make that weak. That will break there if you move that wire very many times. And so we don't want to damage the conductor while removing the insulation. So be careful with that while you're doing that. So everybody take a moment there to remove the insulation. And if you need me to look at it, you can probably hold it up to your camera and we can take a look at your wire and see what you've got there in case you need to redo it or take another try at it. And I'm going to stop sharing my picture so I can see everybody, and then if I need to go back, I'll do that shortly. So how's everybody doing with removing insulation?
Yeah, I think that's gonna be okay.
Let's be able to hear what he's saying.
You're good, okay? And I've got 3 people that I don't have a video, but that's okay. Oh, there's one, okay. So, hello,
Well, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I don't know.
And how did you do with removing your insulation?
I did pretty good actually on that part.
Okay, good. And I don't have a video of Casey, but hopefully you can see our presentation and make progress there. And again, tonight our presentation will be recorded, and I'll put that up on YouTube for you guys so you can rewatch it and go back through any steps if you need to.
Okay.
There we go. We got everybody on now, I think. Okay. And Casey, I believe that's probably not Casey, but how's the insulation look on the end of the wire that you removed?
We're working on it right now. We didn't have everything together, but
Okay,
we're
that's
getting
fine.
it together. So yeah, and it's Carter.
Carter, good, okay.
Yeah, Carter. Here, watch.
And I didn't tell you on the removal of the insulation, what we want to do is go ahead and remove the insulation on all 4 ends of the wires. So you've got 2 wires, 2 ends on each wire. So remove the insulation. You can go ahead and do that on all 4 of the ends. Okay, Casey, that looks good. And don't worry, if you remove a little bit too much insulation, we can always cut the wire down and shorten it a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again here. So we'll go back to our presentation so you can see that. Okay, and again, do you remember what an insulator is? So insulators are what we have wrapped around the wire on the outside, and it does not allow the electrons to flow freely through the material. So this means that the electricity is not going to pass through or travel through the insulator. And if you think of some good insulators here that we have, again, on our wire, we've got plastic or rubber. In Division 1, you may have learned that glass, like the light bulb coating, is glass, and also dry wood. Those are some good insulators. Okay, and then we're going to talk about on one end of each wire, we're going to bend a hook on it, and we're going to install this wire onto our coil. And so we're going to do that, and you can see my picture here as you take the needle nose pliers and grab the very tip of the wire and roll it around and make a little fish hook. And you're going to do that on one end of both wires. So if everybody can do that and get that prepared. And once we get that little fish hook bent, our goal is to be able to install it onto the coil. And this has got 2 terminals on there. It doesn't matter which wire goes on which terminal, but we are going to install that wire. And what you're going to do is use your needle nose pliers to make a good mechanical connection by putting that wire through the little loop and squeezing it down so that it stays onto that loop while you solder that on there. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. And so we want a good mechanical bond so that when we solder it, we have a good electrical bond too. If we just solder it with the wire laying there, it'd be very hard to hold it in place. And then any type of force or movement may break the wire loose. So we want to make that mechanical connection so that it holds that wire on there nice and tight for a long time, hopefully forever. And if anybody wants to give me a thumbs up or a shout out, you can tell me when you're ready to move on, and we'll kind of pause for a moment to let everybody get caught up and get those wires mounted onto the coil. Okay, thanks, Evan.
And you said that this was being recorded, is that correct?
It
So
is
we can
being
go
recorded,
back.
yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I also do have a pre-recorded step through of this slide presentation also. And I sent those out earlier. I can send those out again to everybody in the 2nd division just in case, but I will include this video that I record tonight. Okay, is anybody not ready for me to move on? Okay, we'll talk about soldering here, and we're going to get ready to solder the wires onto the coil here. So you've got both wires mounted onto the terminals or the lugs here of the coil. And this is where you're going to make these soldering connections here. And like I talked here about the mechanical connection, we want to have a good mechanical connection where the wires are secured firmly to the terminals so they don't fall off. That'll help you hold them in place while you solder them. And then also you'll make a good electrical connection if the solder does ever break, but the goal is to have a good electrical connection by adding solder too. And so the trick of doing a solder job, and if you don't have your soldering iron today, you can always come back and do that later. And but it is easier if we do that now so that you can complete putting your shake light together tonight. But if not, you can always watch this again after the session is over. So our soldering iron, and soldering iron is a little bit easier than a soldering gun. A soldering gun is a much larger instrument, and it typically is much higher heat. And so a soldering iron, and sometimes we call those a soldering pencil, is much easier and easier to control with the small hands. And so that is what we prefer to use for our soldering of these small little projects. And typically a soldering iron that's around 25 to 30 watts is best for soldering. And then also we talked about the solder here. That is the metal wire that's going to melt and fill in the connection there, make a good electrical connection. And there are many different types of solder. The smaller gauge of solder allows us, oh, let me add some people to the list here. Sorry, I missed. Welcome. I'm sorry I missed a couple of you. Hopefully you weren't waiting there too long, but we'll let you join into the meeting here.
Are we muted right now?
No, it's not yours.
Yes.
No,
Oh.
it's not yours. It's not yours.
Okay, so I'll continue on here. We'll talk about the solder again. So the solder that we're going to use is going to be a very small gauge. It's probably about the size of a pencil lead, so it's very small. And it's going to allow us to join those metals together by heating and becoming a molten metal. And when it cools down, it solidifies and hardens up and makes a good electrical connection. And again, that solder that we're going to be using here is going to be a rosin core solder. Rosin core solder comes in different mixes, but the most typical one is a 60-40. There are some other ones, but this is a good composition. So it contains 60% tin and 40% lead. And again, lead is there to help the solder flow, but it is poisonous to our bodies if we ingest it. So you don't want to put it in your mouth to hold it while you're working with your setup to solder, or also you want to wash your hands after you're done soldering, so that if you eat a snack or something, a meal afterwards, you don't want to ingest any of that lead particles. Okay. The interior of our solder, if you're using a rosin core, the rosin helps clean the joint and helps the solder flow. And rosin core can leave a yellowish residue that is not harmful to the electrical circuit, so don't worry about that. And you can remove it if you'd like to. There are special flux remover is what we call it, but you can use isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol and an old toothbrush. That works very well to kind of remove that. So you can remove the rosin if you would like to. It just cleans it up and makes it a little bit neater, but it's not required. And then if you do use that isopropyl alcohol, please make sure to protect your work area and your eyes with safety glasses, because you're working with those chemicals. Okay, and then our solder here, our solder is going to melt around 212 degrees to 374 degrees, depending on the composition of the solder. And you're going to use your soldering iron to help heat up the soldering connection. And you're going to use the hot junction to melt the solder, not the hot soldering iron, okay? So if we want to get a good soldering connection there, we want to make sure to heat that up, okay? And then we're going to heat the junction for 2 seconds. And then we're going to remove the heat and then, or add the solder and then remove the heat and wait 2 seconds, okay? So you're kind of going to count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi to heat up the junction, add a little bit of solder, remove the solder, and then count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and then remove the soldering iron to remove the heat. And we're only going to add enough solder to cover both of the wires and the terminals that we're soldering. And we want to be careful not to burn or melt the insulation on the wire. So here's a picture of the process of soldering. And you can see this one's been soldered together, and this one we're getting ready to solder. So I've got the tip of the soldering iron placed on the connection there where I'm touching both the wire and the solder lug. And then we add a little bit of solder to the connection there. And so hopefully everybody will get a chance to try soldering there and soldering that. And as you see, I've got a red tool, the handle of my pliers, sticking through that little coil there to help hold it in place. That kind of helps hold that in place so that it doesn't roll around when you're trying to solder it. Let me put up maybe a little bit bigger picture so you can see what your soldering connection should look like. And I'm getting close to my 30-minute limit here. So while you're soldering here, I'm going to probably work on getting another meeting set up. And you might have to open up your email to rejoin if they kick us out here. Okay, so I went ahead and scheduled another meeting for 7:35. And so everybody can continue working on the soldering process here and take a few minutes to relax. And you can get yourself a drink or come back in about 4 minutes here. And we'll start up another meeting here. I think my time is just about ready to expire here. How's everybody doing on the soldering there? Doing good? Okay, Evan? I think you're the only one that's got a video up, but hopefully everybody okay. Mitchell's doing good. How about Carter? How are you doing?
We're done.
We're doing good.
Okay. Carter, do you have a soldering iron and you're soldering along with us?
Yeah, we're still working on it.
Okay. And then I'm not for sure. We've got Susan here in the window. And Paul. Okay, Paul's doing good. Anybody have any questions about your soldering process. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop this here. And then, like I said, we will, you should have another email that was sent out here. And you should have that information here on your computer so that you can be able to join us and come back with another meeting. I apologize for having to join back. Oh, somebody's got a chat here. So Mitchell is still working on yours, okay? Okay, well, I'm gonna exit here so my computer can save this part of the video, and then we'll join back up in a minute.